Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching video number 4, Virtual Networks. This is part of Fast Track CBT Video Lab, Microsoft Virtualization, Virtual PC, and Server. In this video, we'll be learning about virtual networks exclusively. You'll learn a lot of important facts about virtual networks, how they work, the different drivers and the different defaults that make them work. You'll learn how to configure different types of virtual networks, and then we'll go in and we'll create a new virtual network and attach it to our virtual servers. So let's get started. In our scenario with the Blue Crab Food Company, you now have two virtual servers, and you need to create an ad hoc test environment for these virtual servers to communicate. You'll create a new virtual network for these two machines to communicate on. So before we do that, let's get started and learn a little bit more about virtual networks in Microsoft Virtual Server. Now, before I go through the introduction to virtual networks, I want to point out that when we installed Microsoft Virtual Server and we added our new virtual machine, really we didn't have to do anything except select a network adapter that's connected to the network so that our virtual machine could communicate with a valid network adapter on the virtual host. After that, everything else was pretty much automatic. The virtual server and its virtual network adapter got an IP address through DHCP through an existing router that was already on this network, and everything just worked. Really everything that the host could do, the virtual machine could do as well. So before I went any further with virtual networks and went into all the different complications of virtual networks, I want you to know that for the most part it's almost automatic that your virtual machines will be able to do everything that your virtual host or that your server can do. So don't be worried or intimidated about all the different complexities you can get into with virtual networks. So with that, like we said, with Microsoft Virtual Server and Virtual PC, you can have virtual networks. Now, these virtual networks can be between two virtual guests or between virtual guests and the virtual host. So let me say that again. You could have two virtual machines and they're talking to each other, or you could have a virtual machine talking to the virtual host so that it can communicate out on the network. Or you could have the virtual machine only talking to the virtual host or only talking out to the network. So there's different ways to configure this. Now, when Microsoft Virtual Server is installed on the host, it installs a new network service called the Virtual Machine Network Services driver. And this driver is added to all the different network adapters on the host machine. This allows those adapters to communicate with the virtual guests. So if I go down here to my network adapter, you can see I have this wireless network adapter on this computer that I'm recording on, which is also the host computer for Microsoft Virtual Server. So if I double click on this network adapter and I go into the properties of the network adapter, notice here this virtual machine network service. It says that in the description that this provides networking support for Microsoft virtual machines. So this connection or this protocol here or service was added. Actually, it is a service. Let me correct that. This is a service technically in Windows. This networking service was added when Microsoft Virtual Server was installed. Now this, you'll find out, was added to every network adapter on the host operating system. So if I cancel this and I go into settings, network connections, and let me just open this local area network connection here. Now this is a built-in network adapter on the host machine, and in fact it's not even connected at all to the network. But you see here the virtual machine network service is added on there as well. So this virtual machine network services driver was added to all my network adapters on the host operating system, and it was enabled. And that way the virtual machines can communicate, if they're configured properly, with these different adapters on the host machine. Now, virtual machines can have up to 4 different network adapters. These virtual network adapters can be bound to the physical host network adapter to create virtual networks. So when I say they're bound, that just means inside the virtual server administrative console, I say I'm going to attach virtual machine A, let's say, to network adapter B on the host machine. So I'm creating a connection, and that's called the binding. Um, so those virtual network adapters are bound to the physical host network adapters, and that's what creates the virtual network. Now, something else that I find interesting, and you might too, is that you don't have to have any protocols on the host network adapter for the guest network adapter to use it, other than the virtual machine network services driver. You don't even have to have TCP/IP configured on the host network adapter. Now, this is because the traffic between the guest and the host adapters, when those two are connected together, is bridged. So what that means is, say you had a server and you had two network adapters on it and a single, or I'm sorry, two different virtual machines. And each of those virtual machines, let's say, was bound to each of those different host physical network adapters. You could just configure TCP/IP on the virtual network adapters and nothing more than the virtual machine network services driver on the host physical adapters. Those two would communicate, and then the virtual machines could access the network through those two virtual machine host network adapters. So you don't have to have TCP/IP. So one of the things you might be thinking when it comes to configuring virtual network adapters is, well, if I have a host network adapter and I have a guest network adapter, the virtual network adapter, that's two IP addresses, right? You know, wouldn't I put an IP on each one? And that can be true, but on the other hand, you could just have one IP on the virtual network adapter or the guest network adapter because you don't have to have TCP/IP on the host network adapter. Interesting stuff. So the virtual network adapters will communicate with either one, an internal network, or two, a host network adapter, the external network. That's generally how it's done. Either you have a private internal network that's just for these virtual machines to talk to each other on, or you have the virtual machine connected to the host network adapter, the physical network adapter, to talk to the external network. Generally, it's one of those two options, but there are a couple other ways to do it. Now, if virtual adapters communicate with the internal network only, this is called a guest-only network. And this is also the safest configuration. And when I say safest, I just mean that by the virtual machine being completely isolated, you don't have to worry about that virtual machine getting a virus, sending a virus, the patches not being up to date. No matter what you do on that virtual machine, you're not going to mess up uh, the production network at your business, let's say. So I could install Windows Active Directory. I could install a DHCP server. I could release a virus on the virtual machine if I wanted to, and it wouldn't affect the host network or the physical real network. So that's one of the beauties of virtual networking is you can completely isolate these virtual machines just to themselves or with other virtual machines. So it's very powerful when it comes to testing. Now, you don't have to have a one-to-one relationship between the guest and the host network adapters. Many guest adapters can be connected to a single host adapter. So I could have 10 virtual machines running on this computer here, just attached to my one wireless networking adapter. There's no one-to-one relationship that has to be defined. They can all share a single network adapter if that's what you want to do. If you have a production network that's using a lot of bandwidth, you might want to, you might want to have a one-to-one relationship. But typically, more often than not, you have multiple virtual machines sharing a single host network adapter. So now let's move on to configuring virtual networks. Now, virtual networks are stored in this folder right here, Documents and Settings, All Users, Documents / Shared Virtual Networks. These networks each have their own file that represent, one file represents each virtual network, and it's a .vnc file. It has that VNC extension. So let's go take a look at this. If I go to my computer, I go to I'm going to go to Documents and Settings, All Users, then to Shared Documents. Then I'm going to go to Shared Virtual Networks. This is the folder where our virtual networks are stored. If you notice right here above it is Shared Virtual Machines. This is where our virtual machines are stored, our virtual hard drives, which we'll be talking about in a future video. So here's Shared Virtual Networks. I'm going to double click on this. And inside here you see that I have 4 different shared virtual networks. I have the external network, which is this Broadcom 802.11bg wireless LAN. I have another external network, which is a Realtek gigabit Ethernet adapter. This is my physical Ethernet adapter on this machine. It's not connected to the network. Then I have an internal network, which is a private network just for the virtual servers, if I chose to use it. Then I have a wireless network. And this wireless network really just attaches to this Broadcom Ethernet adapter. So these two here are similar networks. They're both attached to the same physical network adapter. So that's a possibility. Now, by default, most users just have one external network, which goes to their single Ethernet adapter, and then they have one internal network, which goes to their just internal host or a guest-only virtual network. So by default, those would be the two that most people would have. Now, if I right-click on one of these and I go to Edit, it brings up the Windows text editor, and you can see that this is just an XML file. That's what this is. XML version 1.0, and if you go in here, you can actually go in and you can make changes to this and change settings for these virtual networks, but of course I don't recommend that. I recommend using the virtual server web-based administrative console. But these are just text files, and you can actually share these with someone else who had a virtual server, and you could move them from one virtual server to another. So these are your .vnc, your virtual network configuration files. Let's go back to our slides. One thing I want to point out is if you have the remote control application VNC installed, these VNC files associated with virtual server will look like they're associated with the VNC remote control application. In reality, they have nothing to do with it. So say you had VNC installed ahead of time, you installed virtual server, you go into your shared virtual networks folder, you'll see your .vnc virtual network configuration files, but if you double click on one, they'll open up VNC and you'll get an error. And they'll have a little icon next to them that look like they're associated with VNC. If you don't use VNC or you don't have it installed, just don't worry about it. Now, virtual networks can be created, removed, and added back. So, like I said, you could share a virtual network with someone else if they had the exact same network adapter that you did. Or say you had two computers, you could copy a virtual network from one to the other if they had the exact same network adapter on those computers. And then you could add that virtual network to the other computer. So just like a virtual disk, you can create one, which will create the text file. You can remove it from virtual server, just means it doesn't show up anymore, but the configuration is left there still on the hard drive. Then you could add it back to virtual server again. Now, if you're using a guest-only network, this is the private internal virtual server network, you may want to use the DHCP server feature. This is a feature of Microsoft Virtual Server. You can have a DHCP server on any one of the networks that you choose to enable it on. So the DHCP server would hand out IP addresses and IP address configurations to the virtual machines on that network. So what that means is, say I had an isolated guest-only network. I had two Windows XP workstations, let's say, on them. I could configure DHCP to hand out IP addresses to those two machines so that they could communicate. And I'll show you how to go in and configure the DHCP server. Of course, you could also have a virtual machine that's providing DHCP for you. So let's say I have two Windows 2003 servers, and I could make one of them a DHCP server. Of course, it would have to have a static IP address, and it could hand out an IP address to the other one. Or I could have, 5 more Windows XP workstations on that same network, and that Windows 2003 server could hand out IP addresses to all those 5 different XP workstations. So there's a lot of different choices for you. Um, of course, if you have a DHCP server already on your physical network, like say you have a router or a Windows 2003 server that hands out IP addresses to all the computers on your network, when you attach your virtual machine to your host network, to your external network, it would get an IP address through DHCP. So that's another choice, but of course you have to attach the virtual machine to the host network, which sometimes you might not want to do due to testing or depending, what it is you're going to do on that virtual server. Now, whatever you do, make sure that you don't have multiple DHCP servers on the same network. You'll just run into problems when you do that. Just make sure you have one DHCP server. So if you're going to have a guest-only network, um, if you're going to run Windows 2003 server and provide DHCP, make sure you go in and disable the DHCP server that's enabled by default on the internal virtual network. Now, another option I want to mention is with the loopback adapter that's on the host. The loopback adapter, by the way, is actually a virtual network adapter that's installed on really every computer. So this virtual network adapter has an IP address, and what you can actually do is you can create an isolated host to guest network. So I could put that loopback adapter in a network, and I could attach it just to a single virtual machine. And that way, just the host and the guest can talk to each other because that loopback adapter isn't really attached to the physical network. But then another thing I could do with this is I could enable internet connection sharing. So that way the guest virtual machines can access the internet through the host, but they're not really on the host, but they couldn't really attach to the host directly. So you could protect all your virtual machines from the internet with the Windows firewall that you configure on the loopback adapter. So there's some different possibilities using the loopback adapter to create isolated networks or special types of networks. Now, that's not something that most people commonly do. In fact, I've never had a situation where I needed to do it personally, but it's something just to know about, something to have in your toolkit if you ever need it. Most of the time, people are creating either guest-only networks, so you have virtual machines just talking to each other, or they're creating guest-to-host networks so that the guest virtual machine can attach to your regular network and get on the internet, let's say. So we learned about configuring virtual networks. Now let's go and create a new virtual network. So to create a virtual network, we need to open the Microsoft Virtual Server web-based administrative console. I'm going to go down to Start, Programs, Microsoft Virtual Server, and open up the Virtual Server Administration website. I'll have to log in here. All right, so already running, I've got one of the Blue Crab Food Windows servers. Now let's go in and look at the configuration of this server, and I want you to see the current virtual network settings. If I scroll down here, you can see it does have some network traffic that it's sent. And if I go on down here, you'll see a section that says network adapters right here. It says it has virtual network adapter 1. One virtual network adapter is installed. So on the virtual machine, you can have up to 4. Well, currently there's 1 installed, and it's connected to this network that I created called wireless. And its current Ethernet MAC address is right here. So if I click on this network adapters section, it takes me in and it says that basically I can't do anything right now because the machine is running. You can't add or remove virtual network adapters while the machine is running. But if I stop the machine or shut it down, I could remove this virtual network adapter from the virtual machine. That's one thing I could do. I could also connect it to a different network. So if I connected it to this internal network, which is the default virtual server internal network, this is an isolated network, a private network, I would get that computer immediately off of the internet and onto this virtual private network. I could have it not connected to any network at all if I didn't need any network activity. Here, right now, it configures a dynamic MAC address. If I had some reason, I could configure a static MAC address on that machine. So that's how you edit the virtual network adapter properties. Now, I can also go in and I can add a new virtual network adapter. See here, it says we have virtual network adapter 1 on this computer. So we only have one. I can have up to 4. So if I click back, and if I go up to, let's go to the master status here. And let's go into this Blue Crab Food Win Server 2, and I go into Edit Configuration. Let's look at the configuration on this. Well, because this machine is not running right now, I have this button that I did not have on the other machine that was running. I have Add Network Adapter. So here I can add a network adapter, and I can connect it, say, to the internal network. And I'd say OK right there. And that machine now has 2 network adapters. So see right here, here's Virtual Network Adapter 1 and 2. Virtual Network Adapter 1 is connected to wireless. Virtual Network Adapter 2 is connected to the internal network. This is the private network. So that machine has 2 different network adapters. If I started it up, you would see that. And they're connected to 2 different networks. So I could have up to 4 network adapters on this machine connected to different networks. Let's go in and let's remove that. So all I do is I check remove and I say OK. All right, so that's how you add and remove network adapters to virtual machines. So those are network adapters though. Now let's learn about virtual networks. So over here there's a section entitled Virtual Networks. Here I have the option to create new virtual networks. Here I can add a virtual network that's already created. So one of those text files that's already on my hard drive, I could bring it back in and have Virtual Server recognize that. Or I can configure virtual networks. So right now it shows that I have 3 different virtual networks here I could configure. Or if I click View All, I can see the 3 different virtual networks that my virtual server recognizes. So here I have the external network, which is my physical Ethernet adapter. It's not connected to anything. I'm going to go in and edit the configuration. Notice that I could also remove the virtual network. So this is how you remove a virtual network. You go to Virtual Networks, you go to View All, you select the virtual network adapter you want, and you click on Remove. So to edit it, of course, you click on Edit Configuration. And here it gives you some notes about it. It gives you the exact path to the .vnc file, the virtual network configuration file. And then down here you have 2 options. One is the different network settings for this virtual network. The other is the DHCP server configuration. So notice by default DHCP server is disabled. I want to tell you that the DHCP server will be disabled on all physical network adapters by default, but it will be enabled on the internal network by default. So that's how the DHCP server works. You can, of course, go in and configure it however you want. You can enable it on physical network adapters, you could disable it on the internal network, or you can go into the internal network and you can configure it, make changes to it. So with that, let's go into the network settings for this virtual network. And here here's where I rename the virtual network. I can call this whatever I want. My Ethernet adapter on my PC. I could give it a name, whatever name I want to give it. Here I have a list of the physical network adapters that are on this computer that I want to connect this virtual network to. So I can choose whatever virtual network adapter I want to connect it to. Or I could connect it to none. None is a valid choice, which is the guest only. So none means I have a virtual network that really only allows communication between the different guest virtual machines. Down here is just a description. I can make whatever notes I want to make down here in this description. So let's go in and let's create a new virtual network of our own. So let's call this the Blue Crab Food Company's Virtual Isolated Test Network. Now this is going to be connected to no physical network adapters. This is going to be an isolated test network. And I'll say this is for testing of Windows, AD, DNS, and DHCP services. Something you don't want to put on the production network. So I'll say OK. And we just created our new Blue Crab Food Virtual Isolated Test Network. By default, the DHCP server is disabled. If I want, I can go in here and enable it. Let's go ahead and do that. So to enable it, all I need to do is check the checkbox right there to enable it. It already has filled in IP address information. I can go in here and I can change this to whatever I want to. 192, 168, whatever IP addresses I want to use. I recommend using private IP address schemes, but if you had some reason, you could use public IP address schemes as well. Notice there's no default gateway here because this is an isolated network. These machines aren't going to be able to communicate with any other devices on the network or get out to the internet. So there's no sense in having a default gateway. But you could have DNS servers, of course, if you had a DNS server on this isolated network or a Win server. Here you can configure the IP address lease time, the renewal time, and the rebinding time. So I'm just going to take the defaults there and I'll say OK. And notice now it says that the virtual DHCP server is enabled. Okay, so we just created this virtual test network. Well, that's great. But right now there's no virtual machines attached to this test network. So to attach a virtual machine to my test network, I'm going to go to the master status. I'm going to go to one of my virtual machines, and I'm going to edit the configuration. I'm going to scroll down to the network adapter on this machine, click on that, and because the virtual machine is turned off, I can configure this, I can change this. So I can connect this virtual machine's network adapter to whatever virtual network I want to connect to. In this case, we're going to connect to the Blue Crab Food Virtual Isolated Test Network. I'm going to go ahead and say OK here. And now we can go and turn this virtual machine on. I'm going to turn on right here. Just a second, the virtual machine will start up. You can see there's some activity here on the CPU usage graph. I'm going to click on the little screen thumbnail. Have to log on. Shows me the virtual machine starting up. As soon as it boots up, we'll log in, and what I want to show you is that the virtual machine got its IP address from the 10 network or the DHCP server on the isolated guest-only network through Microsoft Virtual Server. So I'm going to go to Start, Command Prompt. I'm going to type ipconfig/all, and sure enough, let's take a look here. Yes, we have our IP address. On our virtual Ethernet adapter, it says we have DHCP enabled. It says our IP address is 10.241.0.16. There's our subnet mask. There's our DHCP server 10.41.0.1. And this just shows that we have our virtual network adapter configured for DHCP from the Microsoft Virtual Server, and surely enough, it is working. So if I went and I started up our other Blue Crab Food Windows server, these two machines, they could communicate on this private network, and Microsoft Virtual Server is handing out IP addresses through DHCP. So let's go ahead and close this out. And if I open up my web browser here, we'll find out that I cannot communicate on the internet. See, everything fails because there's no DNS server on this network, and there's no default gateway that points out to the internet. So in terms of safety, in terms of protecting your regular production network, this virtual machine is completely isolated. So, you could introduce a virus on this if you wanted to test something out like that, like antivirus software. You could do software updates here. You could apply patches. You could, do just about anything you wanted to do. Run a DHCP server or a DNS server. Whatever it is you might want to run that you wouldn't want to do it on your production network. So with that, let's go back to our slides. And we just finished creating a new virtual network. We created the Blue Crab Food Test private network. And with that, we'll go to our conclusion. So in conclusion, in this video, we learned a lot about Microsoft Virtual Server virtual networks. We learned how virtual networks are very important to Microsoft Virtual Server. These virtual networks are what connect you either to the physical network, the real network on your host machine, or they connect multiple guests together in their own private isolated virtual network. We learned how to create these new virtual networks. We learned how to connect network adapters on the host using the virtual server network service. We saw how this is configured on each of our physical network adapters. We learned how to create new network adapters on the virtual host. We learned that you can have up to 4 different network adapters and how you can bind these to different physical adapters on the host machine. Then we went in, we actually created a new virtual network. We saw the default virtual networks, and we just saw how virtual networks really work inside Microsoft Virtual Server. It can be a little confusing at first, but once you understand the basic principles, I hope that through this video, you found that virtual networks are really very simple. With that, that's the end of video number 4. Thank you very much.